So welcome to Life Science Leaders, a series of webinars and podcasts for leaders within the life science industry. Throughout the series, I will be interviewing senior leaders across the sector, covering topics that are relevant to what is happening in the industry right now and how it is affecting businesses, the market and people. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Paul Hercock, who is CEO and co-founder of Mantra Systems. So welcome, Paul. Thank you for taking the time out to be part of this podcast series.
Hi Claire, thank you very much for inviting me along.
You're very welcome. So Paul, can you tell the audience who you are and what you do, please?
Yes, of course. So by background, I'm a medical doctor. So I worked on the front line in the NHS for over 14 years, mostly in the A&E department. I stepped out of clinical practice because I got really interested in medical devices. So I had a medical device startup of my own back in the day, and I started getting more and more interested in how to take medical devices to market. And to help me with that, I actually studied law as well, so that gave me a bit of useful background when working with regulations. And I've spent the last few years in the medical device industry helping a range of different companies prepare for the medical device regulation, and that's how Mantra Systems came to be, to kind of leverage that background and experience that I've built up.
Okay, thank you for that. And I guess the topic that we'll be discussing today is an executive's guide to the medical device regulation, MDR, as most of us know it, and what you need to know. So this is a topic that I'm sure a lot of leaders in the devices side of things will be stressing over and potentially keeping them up at night, Paul. So let me start by asking, what are the major elements of MDR? I guess what do companies need to know? How do they build a strategy and make sure that they're ticking all the boxes?
Yeah, so I mean, it is a really important question, and it's worth putting the MDR into context. I mean, it's more than 100 pages longer than the previous medical device directive. So it's a very weighty piece of legislation. And from its length, it's easy to infer that it sets out quite a broad range of responsibilities that all manufacturers need to be aware of and need to comply with when either bringing a medical device to market or keeping that device in market in the first place. I mean, in terms of the elements of it, it's possible to break it down into fairly simple steps. And what I suggest to people is they start with a really fundamental question, and that's, is my product a medical device? And that sounds like obviously a banal point to begin with, but some products that look and smell like a medical device might fall under different legislation. So blood analyzers that perform an analysis of blood samples, they're not actually covered by the MDR. Any products that can contain viable cellular tissue, similarly, are not part of the MDR. They're not medical devices. Whereas pieces of software that on the face of it couldn't look more different to a medical device, in fact, are caught under the legislation. So is this a medical device? Is a very good place to start. And then if it is a medical device, what risk class is it in? The MDR talks about 4 different risk classes, and what you have to do depends very much on what risk class your device is in. And then there are some really kind of major elements that form the regulatory strategy you have to build around your products. And these, we can talk about these in more detail, but there's a list of common requirements that are specified in the MDR called the General Safety and Performance Requirements. And some, but not all of those, will relate to each product. And it's a really good way to start is, well, which ones relate to my product? What evidence do I have already to prove that my product meets these requirements? And then other big elements are to understand what's called the Unique Device Identifier System, requirements around quality management, the requirements around post-market surveillance and post-market clinical follow-up, and risk management, and finally requirements for clinical evaluation, writing clinical evaluation reports. They're really the big modules under the MDR.
Just a bit of like bedtime reading there.
Absolutely, and it is a real, when people approach this for the first time, including for myself, it's a very intimidating piece of legislation, but actually when you dig under the skin of it, it is at least logically constructed, and by following a set pathway through it, it becomes much, much more digestible, and actually is designed to be digestible and useful.
Okay, that's interesting. So I guess from my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong on anything that we're discussing here, Paul, there's a lot of similar elements in the new MDR versus the MDD. So are you able to share with us what the main changes from old to new are, so that obviously we can give our listeners a bit of, I guess, wider scope on what they should be, looking out for?
Yeah, I mean, this is the good news, I suppose, that ultimately the MDD and the MDR are trying to do the same thing. They're trying to build a regulatory framework that makes it so medical devices are safe and that they do what they say they're going to do. And that so there are a lot of common areas between them. And anybody that's familiar with the MDD, take some comfort. Don't be too put off by the huge increase in size. But there are some really important differences. So we talked before about the general safety performance requirements, these general requirements that all devices will have to adhere to. Well, they weren't present in the MDD. Instead, that was something called essential requirements. And fundamentally, each is designed to do the same thing, but the general safety performance requirements are more extensive and are different. And so it's not a safe assumption that if you met the essential requirements, you will meet the general safety performance requirements. So that's an important difference to understand. A really interesting difference is that there's been an alteration to the finer points of the definition of a medical device. So this ties into what we talked about before. So some devices that never used to be medical devices will now be caught by this legislation. An interesting example is cosmetic contact lenses. So lenses that have no function in terms of altering the vision, but are designed to do things for parties, cat's eyes or different coloured irises. Now, they're not a medical device by purpose, but there is a part of the definition that says if something is sufficiently similar to an actual medical device, then it will be brought into that definition, whether it's intended by the manufacturer or not. So that's quite important. I suppose a big hitter difference is simply the need for more clinical data, more clinical evidence. Yeah. The way the MDR is structured means there's just more that you have to prove. So studies, more companies will need to do more studies than they've done before, and perhaps more high quality evidence will need to be produced. In some cases, devices have been reclassified. So we mentioned before, there are 4 risk classes. That was true in the MDD, as well as now in the MDR. But some products have changed risk class. So some software, especially, software has been, certain software has been caught by medical device legislation in the past, but a lot of software now will be class 2A as opposed to class 1, which creates additional burdens for the producers of that software. And then there's some miscellaneous differences. So it's kind of the same as before, but more of it. So post-market clinical follow-up, for example, if you had a class 1 device in the past, the medical device directives really light touch on that. Almost just a nod to PMCF was enough. Whereas now you need a detailed PMCF framework for every device, regardless of risk class. It's a very important difference.
Yeah, that is. That's clearly one of the biggest ones there. But just going back actually to what you were mentioning about like the cosmetic lenses, for example. I mean, obviously, I am a lens wearer, but a prescribed lens wearer. From my understanding, though, like cosmetic ones and coloured ones, you could buy from Amazon and things like that. So, I mean, I'm guessing that's either going to impact that market or it's going to eradicate it, or people are just going to be buying stuff online that they probably don't really know whether or not it's actually safe to be putting in their eyes. So that's an interesting thing.
Yeah, and what it means is that it opens the door to producers of products kind of casually wandering into this arena without even really being aware of it. And we are seeing that in 2 areas. You mentioned Amazon products. Well, there are a lot of medical type products that are sold on Amazon that will in fact meet the definition of medical device, and products in the App Store as well. Increasingly, there's medical type apps, and software producers might not necessarily know a great deal about medical device regulation in general. So,
absolutely. You may find that the manufacturers do, but I wonder whether or not the consumers do, because that's an interesting point. Being in the healthcare recruitment game, obviously that's something that I'm aware of, but I bet the everyday person that's out there, let's say just jumping online and ordering some coloured lenses or for a fancy dress or whatever, probably has no idea about this. So yeah, that's a really interesting piece of information there. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, so, and sorry, but this is why it's important, because for executives, people, decision makers, people allocating resources in businesses, it's more and more important that they're aware of this, so that they don't find
Yeah.
that their products are, kind of accidentally caught by this legislation.
Absolutely. Yeah, you raise a really good point there, because I would imagine that not everybody is fully aware of that, as we've been exploring. So I guess, what's the impact to organisations now that these changes are coming? For example, around cost, or we spoke about legacy devices, for example. And what are the external factors that organisations or executives should be thinking about around this sort of subject?
Yeah. So I mean, this cuts to the crux of why there've been, I guess, some concerns in the industry, and actually why there's been a 1-year delay to the MDR's implementation due to COVID and everything that's happened afterwards. The bottom line is that the cost to get a product to market is going to increase under the MDR, almost always. And I think the disparity in cost in many ways will be greater for devices in lower risk classes than in higher risk classes.
Interesting.
So if you had a class,
that actually, whether or not it would depend on the device of how that cost will change.
Yeah, and I think it's really because if you had a class 3 device under the Medical Device Directive, let's say a hip implant or something similar, that's inherently quite a risky device. It's permanently implanted into someone, so you had to have a really extensive framework around that anyway. And so the MDR says, yes, you need an extensive framework, but you're tweaking an existing system. Whereas if you have a device in a lower risk class, you may find that you suddenly have to produce a lot of structures and systems that you didn't need before. And so you might need staff you didn't need before. And simply meeting these obligations costs money. Every clinical investigation costs money. So if you need to perform more of them, then your cost to market is increased. The other thing is time. So clinical data takes a long time to generate. An old professor of mine back in my clinical days used to say it takes 2 years to generate 1 year data, because you have to design and set up the study, which takes time. You have to get it approved, and then you have to run it long enough to actually collect 12-month data. So companies that are on the treadmill now as they move towards May next year will find that time pressures are starting to be a factor. And when companies or executives are making decisions about bringing new products to market and doing forecasting of costs and expenditure, it's important to be aware that these costs will increase, and you perhaps won't get revenue back as quickly as you might have done under the MDD. Really important. Yeah. And then another side that you mentioned is about legacy products. A lot of big companies especially might have a wide range of products to address a similar problem, and they'll have users which are very keen on their legacy products, and that the companies happily sold to over the years. But it might be that the costs associated with meeting the medical device regulation obligations mean that it's no longer commercially viable to keep these legacy products under regulatory approval.
You raised some really good points there, and I mean, certainly from our side of things in the talent world, when we're speaking to CEOs and executives, around their recruitment, generally the challenges that they face in recruitment is time, team, and money. And it's really interesting how you've touched on all three of those in a different capacity, in terms of obviously the MDR regulations and how that might affect businesses. So I guess not only are executives stressing about time, team, and money from a productive perspective and an operational point of view, but obviously now they've got to think about that with the MDR side of things coming into fruition as well. So, yeah.
I mean, there are different approaches to this. I mean, there's no doubt that if you are someone who has regulatory capabilities in terms of talent, you're quite hot property at the moment, because companies do recognise they need to increase headcount in this area. But of course, another approach, or done sensibly, it's done in parallel really, is an upskilling of staff that are already there. Again, sometimes companies have to look elsewhere for where that upskilling is coming from, but it's a great way to make sure that the company is beginning to prepare for this full implementation date next year.
Absolutely. And any new businesses that are starting up in this area, because again, as well, our customer base isn't just established organisations or, big corporates. We work with a lot of startup companies and SMEs. So any new businesses that are starting in this area, what would you suggest to them being the best way to set themselves up to ensure that obviously they're compliant?
Yeah, so it's almost a two-edged sword in a way. Obviously, it's a challenging thing to have to grapple with as a new business because it's complicated and it's quite involved, and there's so many balls to juggle in the early days of a business. But in a strange way, a new business that's almost an advantage because they have a carte blanche. So they're starting from a fresh piece of paper, and sometimes reverse engineering or making adaptations to systems that have been there for a long time can be harder than building a fresh system from scratch. Yeah. So as a new business, there is at least that kind of side advantage that all your processes, regulatory processes, can be designed from the bottom up with the MDR's of requirements in mind. And that can make a big difference. But I think what I would say to any new business is get hold of this early. Yeah. So it's something that can't be left until you're almost at market. So, and I'll give some specifics of that. As part of the documentation package that you have to present to a regulator, you have to have historical files related to your device. So a device history file, a design history file, to
how far would that need to go back, Paul?
So best practice is to go right back to original conception of the device.
Oh, okay.
So even if it's just a list of requirements on a sheet of A4 paper, we'd like to build a product that will do this, this, and this, and it definitely won't look like this, but it may look like this. That's great. That should go in a file, and so that opens the door to careful document management, making sure that you have a version history of all these documents. If one becomes obsoleted, then have that within a document management process, because right from day one, if you're thinking one day a regulator is going to look at this, you're in much better shape than someone who has a product that's pretty much ready to go, and then they think, okay, the final thing we need to do is get a CE mark, and everything's been hinging on getting this product into market that year. And you suddenly find it's going to take 2 or 3 years more before you can get into market. Well, that could be the end of a startup.
Yeah.
So it's planning for resource, time, and cost right from day one, and hardwiring that into the development plan. So it's one of the biggest messages. Just if you have a Gantt chart or something similar for your time to market, MDR requirements should be embedded within that right from the start. So I think that's a big one. So don't ignore it. The other thing I would say is think really carefully about the intended purpose of the device you want to bring to market.
Okay.
It's very tempting if you're developing a product for one particular purpose to say, well, with a minor adaptation, it could also do something else. So it might be, trying to think of an example, it might be, let's say, a scanner. Mm-hmm. So it operates in some way, and let's say it's designed to scan the bladder. But you look at it and you say, well, actually, if we change it slightly, we could scan heart vessels, and we could do all sorts of things, or we could scan eyes to see if people have got cataracts. And that all sounds great from a marketing perspective, but every additional function carries with it an additional regulatory burden. And so think carefully about it.
Sorry, if you changed it, would that mean, again, producing clinical evidence and data around, it's now we're looking at it doing a different scenario. So I guess you needed to have clinical data to back up that evidence, that you can't just say, well, actually, we've just decided that it's going to do this, but we've got nothing to back it up.
No, and that is a really important difference, or a really important point, that every single one of these has to be evidenced in some way. With the slightly fictional example I've just talked about, that might mean a whole separate clinical trial, which could carry with it, a 6-figure sum potentially. So that's extremely important. I just want to mention something that I neglected to mention before when you asked about the big differences between the two pieces of legislation, because this also ties in to what a startup may need to consider, and that's that there used to be a concept called equivalence. That's that if you have a new product that is arguably quite similar to one that's already in the market, you could piggyback on their regulatory approval and say our device is basically the same, so we can use all their files. Under the MDR, it is orders of magnitude harder to successfully claim equivalence. So another message to either a new business or an established business bringing a new product to market is, I'd always go as far to say, unless the equivalent device is one of your own devices,
Okay.
don't do it. Assume you need a new system from the start.
In your experience, Paul, and obviously being in the industry and business that you're in, did you find previous to MDR that there were quite a lot of devices or companies that were kind of, I guess, piggybacking and jumping on the back of someone else's product, if you like, and saying, ours does exactly the same thing, so we can just, evidence and say that clinical data. So I guess there probably was quite a lot of that happening.
Yeah, and it's, with a slightly cynical eye, it's kind of amusing because from a regulatory perspective, our product's basically the same as our competitors.
Okay.
And from a marketing perspective, our product's completely different and infinitely better. And so, yeah, I suppose,
really, isn't it? Absolutely.
I mean, you can easily see the reasons for it, but I think the regulators have said, well, I think we've wised up to this now. So if you say you're different, you're going to have to prove you're different. Yeah. So, but I've had some interesting conversations with people in the industry about.
I can imagine. So would it make sense, I guess, to a startup company? Because I think that's really valuable information that you definitely just imparted there. So if, let's say, for example, a startup had a product that they wanted to bring to market and initially had an idea for, one, this is going to focus on doing wonders in one area. And then, as they were going through that sort of producing the clinical evidence and data, and then thought, well, actually, maybe this can be used for something else. Would you advise that they run sort of clinical trials parallel? Or I guess, it's all around cost, isn't it? As you say, it's not a cheap scenario to go through clinical trials with anything. So what would your advice be around that?
Yeah, it comes down to strategy. This again is why it's so important to think about this from the very inception of the device. It's so much easier if it's down on paper at the start. We think we might be able to do something else with this down the line. Okay, design everything towards both of those. It's important. I don't want the message to be, allow this to be a barrier to fulfilling the full potential of your device. That's a shame. That's a disaster. That's not something you need to do. But be very wary of late stage bolt-ons is what I would say. And when I've advised people in the past, I've said, okay, if you spend a little bit more in this clinical data generation process, or if you tweak your post-market surveillance system in this way, or your post-market clinical follow-up system in this way, it will be more able to accommodate later changes. Whereas if you make it very, very rigid and you don't have that level of foresight, you won't be able to expand your indications for your product. And of course, it's a bit like a driving test. People learn much more about their products once they get to market and in the hands of users, and people start using them in ways they never imagined. I mean, I used to do that all the time in clinical practice. I used to use a gynecological product to take foreign bodies out of children's ears. It was never intended for that purpose, but you tweak it and bend it a little bit, and it was brilliant to take the beads out of this. And that's just an example that, in a way, the manufacturers of that product, it's a fairly low value item, but they're missing a market. And under the MDR, they would need a full regulation.
If listeners are listening to this, there's in that space, they'll be picking up on your idea there, Paul.
Well, I mean, you can have that for free, but it's just an example that you learn more after you put things into market. And
very true.
Having a sensible and well thought out, well planned MDR strategy will allow you to capture full value of your products. A lot of the costs associated with this are at the front end. So the more you get back at the back end, and the more you increase your chances of capturing as many sub-markets as possible with your product, the more quickly you recoup that cost. It makes a huge difference.
Yeah, that makes sense perfectly. And I guess obviously given the pandemic, that we're all facing globally right now, we, especially in our side of things, we're now seeing a lot more telemedicine, organizations now, of course, the whole scenario has changed, even to book an appointment with a doctor. But our clients are definitely going more down telemedicine apps, device kits. What does this mean for the industry and the new MDR? As I know that some software did fall under MDD, as we touched on at the beginning of this. So where does the dividing line fall in devices when it comes to software now, Paul?
Yeah, so this is going, as you rightly say, this is going to become a really big area. Telemedicine is one part of it, but you mentioned apps and programs as well. So even before the pandemic, we were seeing software that's that has artificial intelligence that can make diagnoses or assist diagnoses. And with the rise of smartphones and apps, there's more and more apps and programs that will help the layperson make a diagnosis, almost saying, you should go and seek medical help, or this is a suspicious skin rash, or your blood pressure is changing in a way that's of concern. So, and I think with access to face-to-face healthcare being more challenging now, and maybe even for the foreseeable future, this is going to be a very, very big area. And so there's so many different types of software. And again, I think this is one of the motivations behind replacing the MDD with the MDR, because the MDD was drafted at a time where medical software was far more simplistic than it is now. And in a way, the MDD just couldn't cope with the explosion in complexity and diversity of medical software. But some very simple rules of thumb can help in navigating this area. Any software that performs a simple administrative or archive and retrieval type function is not likely to be a medical device. Okay. So an example I've used in the past is that software that helps medical staff coordinate their rotas. Okay, that's related to the provision of healthcare, but that's not a medical device. That's a straight replacement of a paper-based system. Similarly, an app that simply logs people's blood pressure over time, but doesn't provide any additional information, that's archive and retrieval, and it's not likely to be a medical device. Whereas if that same blood pressure app did what I mentioned before and tracks the blood pressure over time and raises an alert or highlights worrying trends, well, that's adding medical value. And if you have software that's adding medical value, you're very likely to be caught by the medical device regulation. Right. And that could be quite simplistic, and it could be a surprise to some people. And the other interesting thing is, if you stray as a software manufacturer into this arena, then it's actually quite unlikely, or there's comparatively small amounts of software that are class 1, which is the lowest class. Yep. Much of it will be class 2A or above, which means you need a fairly substantial regulatory package around it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, do you tend to find that the organisations that obviously have the devices, would they necessarily have their own software? Would they outsource that to a company? And, so I guess I wonder if there's a third party involved, from a software perspective or technology perspective, how is that managed by the company that's, obviously onboarded the third party organisation to operate the software or create the software for them?
Yeah, I mean, this comes to another rule. I mean, let's say that you are the owner of a business and you say, okay, we don't have the software capability in-house, so we're going to send that out to the software manufacturer, a software producer rather. As this originating organization, you're still the manufacturer. Even though you've outsourced that to someone else, you still have regulatory responsibility for that. So it is your responsibility to produce the MDR package around that software. Now, you can make demands of your subcontractors or your third parties and say, you need to work to our quality management system, and you need to adhere to a range of other standards. GDPR might be another one. You still assume primary responsibility. And so another message I say fairly often is that if you have a business presence in the European Union and you're involved in the selling of medical software or devices, you need to make sure that you are fulfilling your MDR obligations. Even if that might be software or a hardware device that is fully approved outside the European Union, you assume responsibility for it.
Yeah. Have you found that most clients that obviously use your services and come to you for help and advice, are they aware of this? Has this been something that has come as a bit of a surprise to some people, maybe in the, the digital healthcare space?
Yeah, I mean, there's a pretty good level of awareness, I think. As I said before, the software of certain types was caught by the medical device directors, so it's not a complete surprise to people. Although having said that, we certainly do come into contact with producers of either hardware or software devices that were completely unaware this would relate to their products, and are a little bit alarmed and surprised, and normally quite relieved to have this signposted, because if you are selling a product without the correct authorizations in this area and you're caught doing so, then that's not a good situation to be in. You without realizing it, you are directly reportable to the Medicines Healthcare Regulatory Authority, so essentially straight to the government, so definitely to be avoided.
Yeah. Definitely. And we spoke a little bit earlier around, talent, and I guess certainly what we've been finding, as I say, is definitely, we always know that regulatory people are not easy to find in this industry at all. And I think we've been experiencing a lot more companies wanting to get regulatory people on board for a number of different reasons, not even just because of, obviously MDR. So in your opinion, what will companies need to ensure that they have in place from a regulatory and compliance team moving forwards? And I guess, how do you see this affecting the talent side of things, given that there's a shortage in the market already?
Yeah, so the number one thing I would say is that, with an exception, which I'll come on to in a moment, every company will need a nominated person responsible for regulatory activities.
And they're all a qualified person.
Yes, so and the MDR itself actually says what qualifications these people need to have. So if I remember rightly, you need to either have a suitable background in law, medicine, pharmaceuticals, or pharmacy, or the scientific discipline, plus at least a year's experience in regulatory or medical affairs.
Okay.
Or you might not have to have those background qualifications, but you need to have at least 4 years experience in regulatory affairs or medical affairs. So the talent pool of those people is shrinking every day as companies bring those on board. But this is good, because it's become a very interesting and dynamic part of the jobs market. And what a great thing to get into for science graduates, people that have studied relevant, or even engineering is another one. This is an amazing area to get into. Medical devices is becoming such an exciting part of the whole therapeutic sector. This is a great opportunity for people to come into a part of medicine which is changing so quickly and seeing so much innovation. So although there is much greater demand and it can be tight to find people, it will be filled eventually, because people will be drawn into it out of natural interest. The slight caveat to what I've just said is that small companies don't need necessarily to have their own in-house responsible person. Mm-hmm. So there is a slight backdoor available. So they can have this person external to their business, but they need to be continually and permanently at their disposal.
Right.
So that might be engaging someone as a contractor, or mm-hmm. someone who's part of another business that provides these types of services. So there is a get out, especially if you're a startup, because there's a recognition that it's simply impractical to take on someone with that level of experience when you are just building a business from the bottom.
Yeah.
Or if you have a brand new product, which you might not have it. Yeah.
Again, we speak to CEOs of startups all the time, and I think there's a common trend at the moment around, because they're going through funding or whatever scenarios that they're going through, to actually have all the people on board can be, a bit of a challenge initially. So there's obviously, they can outsource it. I just wanted to make sure that obviously that was compliant under the MDR regulations for organisations that were potentially thinking about that as a solution in an interim. And would that, if they did outsource it to an organisation, would they have to maintain working with that one company or that one individual through a series of process to ensure that there's, again, consistency there?
Yeah, so it's about, I say, continually and permanently are the words that I think are used in this section of the MDR. That's not to say you can't change the person. So if they become unavailable or the working relationship breaks down, you just need to make sure you find a person with equivalent qualifications, and you'd need to demonstrate continuity. So some handover process or similar. But there is certainly scope to do that. But the general rule is, engage someone that you can foresee you will have access to until such a time that you have your own in-house person. And remember that potentially, depending on the background of the company founder or the CEO themselves, if they have a science, medicine, law, engineering background, if they're heavily involved in regulatory processes, it may be that after a year they meet this definition themselves. So that's something to consider as well.
Perfect. I guess the biggest challenge that I certainly hear from my clients in the devices side of things, and causing them the biggest headache, is meeting the requirements in time for the deadline. Now, obviously, we spoke about it's been moved, obviously due to the corona, but even though that date has been moved, what would be your critical pointers around this, Paul?
Yeah, so I think number one in neon lights, it would be to say that some companies, not all, but there are certainly companies that have breathed a big sigh of relief that it's been put back a year and it's been removed from the in tray and put on the back burner. Take it off the back burner and put it back onto the in tray, because the time to think about this is now. These systems take time to implement, and they have to be carefully planned and thought through. It's not possible to just throw something together. It will come unstuck. So yes, absolutely. Start now is the main thing, and allocate resources now as well. Plan for what you will need. Think about if you want to collect data after the device has been released on the market, or after the implementation of the full implementation of the MDR, whichever comes sooner. You're going to need customers who are happy to engage with data collection processes. So start those conversations now. Think about customers that you have a good relationship with and say, would you be interested in working with us? We'd like to do some post-market clinical follow-up of our products. We can work together. This is an opportunity to build relationships with customers that can have great commercial value, never mind regulatory value. So definitely start right now is the main thing I would say.
And I think, as you were mentioning earlier, someone wise in your career once said that, to collect, I think, to quote, I don't know if I'm going to get this quote right, but to collect 12 months of data takes 13 months or something you were saying.
To collect 1 year's data takes 2 years.
Wow. Yeah, definitely. So time to not breathe that sigh of relief, as you say, take it out of the out trail, or on the back burner, and make sure that it's a priority for organisations. Critical.
And there will be problems along the way. That's the other thing. So we keep talking about clinical investigations, and that's because so much of working with the MDR is about compiling, using, and applying clinical evidence. So you have to build that from somewhere. A lot of clinical trials need approval, and that takes time. So that might be ethical approval, it might be administrative approval, but that takes a long time, and there's no shortcut to it. And so it has to be started as soon as possible, really. And ideally also done in tandem with a good understanding of how that process works, in order to make sure there are as few blind ends as possible.
And I understand as well, have the regulatory bodies been, I guess it's kind of shrunk as well, hasn't it? There's only a smaller number of regulatory bodies now. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah,
a lot smaller.
You're absolutely right. So this is another fascinating aspect of this, and that's that, leaving class 1 devices aside, all of the device classes will need to engage what's called a notified body in order to get a CE mark. And now even some class 1 devices will, if they're sterile or they have a measuring function. So the demand for notified body time has increased massively. But at the same time, all the notified bodies have had to be themselves recertified against the MDR. And so I hope these figures are up to date, but under the MDR, there was something like 93 notified bodies in the European Union. And I think as of today, only 9 of those have achieved MDR certification.
Wow.
So that's partly because some of them have decided this is not an area for us. They do other types of certifications, but some of them because they just haven't met those requirements yet. That's a big problem, because that means there's a queue, people waiting to get into the notified bodies. And it's even more of a reason to have everything in place as quickly as possible so you can join that queue.
Yeah, that's a massive drop, isn't it? From 90 something down to 9 so far. And like you say, in the current situation, I bet everybody's, until obviously the date was pushed back, kind of trying to get their bits and pieces together. So I would imagine that there's a horrendous backlog of things going on. So even more time pressured and time sensitive for organisations, definitely.
Yeah.
So what does this mean to, for the future of the devices industry, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to think all this looks rather bleak, more money, more time to market. That's not the case, okay? Working with the MDR is if you do it properly, it's a fantastic way to secure your market position and to demonstrate to the market and to customers and even patients, we have a really safe device that works really well. So this is going to differentiate the good products from the okay products. And that's why it's even more of a tragedy when people that have really good products don't engage with this properly, because leave the regulatory side to one side, you're missing out on a commercial opportunity as well. And ultimately, it's going to make medical devices safer and better.
Yes.
We're going to have more confidence. We're all going to be a patient at some stage. So we're going to have more confidence that these devices work and do as they're intended. I mean, there have been big problems with medical devices in the past, notorious cases in multiple different sectors. And the whole aim is to reduce those to the absolute minimum. Nothing will ever completely eliminate that as a possibility, because all medical interventions carry a risk. But the MDR is kind of obliging manufacturers to make sure everything's been done, and it's much more robust from that perspective. It might mean that there are fewer competitors potentially, and it might mean that there are fewer alternative devices in one particular area. We talked before about legacy devices. I think a lot of those will go by the wayside, which means we'll have more modern devices that have been developed with today's health architecture in mind, and that can be a good thing as well. But I do think it means more cost to market, more time to market, and a greater importance to make sure that companies have everything in place that they need.
Sorry, Paul.
No, that's fine.
Picking up on my screen, I thought I got rid of all of them. Yeah, and you raised some really, really valid points there. And of course, to us, the patients, and it's going to make it safer no matter what. At the end of the day, obviously there's regulations in place for a reason. So certainly, like you say, we're all patients at one point. So I guess we can't complain about this so much. So I guess to summarise on today's subject, Paul, are there any sort of top tips that you would just say? If there's nothing else, just remember these.
Yeah, so I would say, number one, plan ahead and start. The more you plan it, the more you bake this into your business, the better you will do. And for heaven's sake, don't ignore it. So start now. Don't make assumptions based on your position under the Medical Device Directive if you have a product that's already been in market. It's challenging to re-engineer systems, but start with a fresh piece of paper and view this as a kind of a refresh of your regulatory strategy. Consider all the separate elements. So right at the start, we talked about all of those. Some people might be more reluctant to engage in risk management, or, I'll leave post-market clinical follow-up, or, we'll deal with the writing the CR later. No, treat them all with equal importance, because they all have to be done. And without one, the whole system fails. So follow a structure is the other thing I would say. Is this a medical device? What class is it in? What general safety performance requirements apply? What evidence do we have? What evidence do we need? What other systems do we need to build? And if you don't have the expertise in-house, engage a specialist and engage them early. And they'd be my top tips for working with the MDR.
That's fantastic. Well, we need to wrap up here, Paul, even though I could go on talking about this for ages, actually. And I think, it's a really topical subject and obviously very, very important to what's happening now. So I'd really like to thank you personally once again for joining me today and sharing your thoughts with me and the audience. I'm sure they will find it absolutely invaluable. And of course, if anyone that is listening wants to reach out to Paul, then please feel free to do so. I'm sure that he will be only too happy to speak to you. We will obviously put your branding up as well, Paul, so that people know how to reach out to you.
Fantastic.
So, great. And so that's it for today's podcast. Join me again for the next episode in the series, where I will have another guest on to talk about more relevant topics. We hope that you found this beneficial, helpful and insightful, and look forward to next time. So bye for now.
Thanks very much.